Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Hopkins at Home. I am Otis Johnson Jr. I am a newly arrived professor at Johns Hopkins University in the departments of Health Policy and Management within the Bloomberg School of Public Policy, also within the School of Education, where I'm executive director of the Hopkins Center for Safe and Healthy Schools. In addition to the Hopkins Center for Safe and Healthy Schools, I also direct the Institute in Critical Quantitative, Computational, and Mixed Methodologies. And today I'll be sharing some of my work from the Race, Gender, and STEM and Social Control Lab, really about the Shutdown STEM effort that was launched in 2020 and connecting that initiative to race and policing to STEM inequities. So some may ask, what does policing and the problem with disproportionate fatalities for BIPOC or people of color, what does that have to do with STEM inequality? And the way that I would answer that is the same social forces that lead to disproportionate rates of police violence against Black, Indigenous, and Latinx populations are also present in our schools in determining who masters mathematics, who graduates, and who enters college. So one of those social forces is social control. And we define social control as the forces that maintain social order through, in this case, informally, an adherence to internalization of shared norms, internal group regulation, and a repressive moral code that is similar to stigma or shame or isolation. But we're also concerned about formal social control, and that is the state and the state apparatuses and the institutionalization of how we regulate social life, including laws, government, and then all of those practices that arise in response to perceived deviance. And we should be reminded that any society, even with a relatively effective system of social control, the informal type, would require some element of coercion. So in that, we see state and institutions enact what we call social control technologies. And we'll be talking about that in greater detail later in this presentation. But I wanted to think about how that force, that social force, is manifest within schools and how it's impacted our responses to what really is normative child and adolescent behavior. So since the 1970s, the yearly high school suspension rate and expulsion rate has increased by 40% up to its current rate at in 2018. Similarly, we've increased the presence of law enforcement on high school campuses, elementary schools as well, by 16% since school resource officers were first introduced in the early 1990s. And also, we've increased public schools' use of security cameras by 62%. And that increase is inclusive of metal detectors, cameras, and other means of surveillance in schools. But at the same time, we can't say that these technologies have been driven by, I guess, problematic adolescent or child behavior. For example, school victimization rates have actually declined in recent years, actually in recent decades. Same way with school homicides as reported by the CDC. Similarly, teacher reports of threats have decreased and now are about 10%. So there are ways in which our use of these technologies may not align well with actual behavior. So I'd like to point out here then that we've just in general as a society become more sensitive to disorder and social disorder and have put in place a more strict response to those perceived differences in behavior. And here we've then seen what might be an explosion of referrals and arrests within schools. In San Bernardino, for example, from 2005 to 2014, there were about 7,000 youths arrested on the streets, in neighborhoods. But over 30,000 of them were arrested within schools. So now a significant proportion of the incarcerated have been introduced to prisons through schools. And we're also expanding our infrastructure for social control. In this case, we're now using facial recognition software in schools. And oftentimes, there's a backlash to this. But nonetheless, we seem to be innovating in ways in which to control students and to maybe mitigate that unwanted mass shooting. But at the same time, we need to be asking, what will those technologies achieve when they're not thwarting the next gun or mass shooting? So the other social force that we need to be concerned about is racism. And in this case, we're talking about systemic racism. And I define that as a pattern of racial preference and marginalization that manifests within institutions and practices that become semi-autonomous mechanisms intent on reifying racialized structures and structural racism. And so you might ask, what is structural racism? It's really a social order achieved via legal, interpersonal, and systemic subjugation of individuals defined by socially constructed racial designations and relative power. And here, caste, settler colonialism, apartheid, Jim Crow, white supremacy, and racial stratification are just some examples of structural racism. And this structural racism, when it intersects with social control, leads to disproportionate rates in suspension and expulsion and punishment within schools. And we can look to Black students nationally as an example. While they're 15% of all public school students, they're 31% of those referred to police. And that's a 5% increase since 2013. Also, 6% suspension rate in 1973 has actually risen in recent years to the point where that rate is 25% for Black males and 14% for Black females. And then also, we see that there are some other ways in which race has intersected with other social categories, such as disabilities. So here, Black students have a 77-day instruction gap between them and white students who have also been labeled disabled. So while these inequalities definitely have a racialized and minoritized basis, some may think that, well, perhaps there are differences in behavior between these groups. But we can also see that there's systemic racism in play when we equalize student behavior. And here we can look at the 2018 Maryland State indicators for disproportionate minority contact of youth. And we see that for intake, secure detention, juvenile corrections, and adult court transfers, there's a higher odds ratio for those youth of color than white youth who also have committed similar offenses. So at the entire continuum of the procedural justice process, we find that there's a difference at each point that leads Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students at a greater likelihood of facing stiffer punishment. And we also know that those expanding technologies, those algorithmic-based predictive models and the facial recognition software is also, in a way, capturing and pushing forward some of the racial biases that we actually have in our population. And here we've seen federal studies confirm that there is racial bias in facial recognition and AI, and also that there are companies such as Google that are banking on these systems for the future and being very protective of researchers who are finding and publicizing that some of these systems are inherently racially biased. So I've painted this bigger picture, and I want to make the connection more salient here. And while, yes, we could argue that um, there's a connection between policing and STEM equity, just by trying to get some of those forces out of the school. I want to suggest that um, the connection is actually more pervasive and consequential because it impacts more than just those who are directly targeted by these systems. So we've come up with this overall hypothesis to bear this out, that the order, conformity, and obedience seeking technologies to which certain racial gender groups are disproportionately exposed are actually related to lowered levels of the qualities that are known to support success in STEM, including creativity, collaborative problem solving, curiosity, interpersonal confidence, and self-efficacy. So here we have STEM as this opportunity structure within schools. But we also have this other parallel opportunity structure to move into the prison industrial complex functioning within schools called the school to prison pipeline. And what this work suggests is that there's a relationship between the two, and that draining the school to prison pipeline is possibly a way to actually help fill the STEM pipeline. And this definitely takes on additional racial significance because we know that STEM jobs are really an important and growing opportunity within society for great wages and all of the other social opportunities that come along with it. And that sector of our workforce is growing. But we also know that the white and Asian share of the STEM workforce is 70% and 14% respectively, while those populations just being 73% of the working age population. So the conclusion to take away from these data is that the STEM pipeline won't be filled by relying on those populations who have traditionally been and remain overrepresented in them. The only way that we're going to fill these occupations is through greater access for those who are traditionally marginalized. That would mean moving individuals from the school to prison pipeline into the STEM pipeline. And so our research team decided to take on many of these issues. Um, Race, gender, and social control in STEM then was a way to urge the NSF to think differently about what are the likely contributors to a stronger, healthier STEM workforce. And so in doing so, we relied on longitudinal data. And in this case, two sources. One is the ELS and another is the high school longitudinal study. Both are nationally collected longitudinal surveys by the National Center of Education Statistics of the US Department of Education. And we decided to use these data to do a few things in terms of methods. One, we wanted not only to understand the experiences of those who might have been suspended or expelled, or those who, or students who have somehow experienced social control and racism. We also wanted to test the alternative hypothesis about what are the rates of college going and mathematics performance in those schools where um, uh, there may be less social control and a more permissive and supportive environment. So we employed counterfactual modeling because it allows us to not only test that hypothesis, but also to test the alternative hypothesis. We also use propensity scores, estimated with machine learning, because we were interested in strengthening um, our inferences about the impact of social control. So in this case, we do have those who are in high social control schools, versus those that are in low social control schools matched via the propensity scores, in this case, weighting. We also use multi-level statistical modeling because we're interested in between school variation as well, because there are schools that have not only differences in their social control, but also in school size and sector and all these other school differences that we thought might be important. So in our methodology, in the first study, we actually looked at ISS. And when I say ISS, I'm talking about in-school suspension. And so we looked at all of the students that, or looked at the data um, and put them in categories, developed a school average of the rate of in-school suspension, and then we segmented that distribution into quintiles. And we took the top quintile and the bottom quintile and labeled the top quintile or designated it high social control schools, and then designated the lower quintile low social control schools. And then, of course, we use some procedures to deal with missing values. So not to go deeply into the propensity score procedure here, but I did want to point out that we do checks to make sure that the groups, those that are in high social control schools versus low, are balanced and that they are otherwise pretty similar on their background characteristics. And then we then performed sensitivity analyses to make sure that there were no confounders. And so what resulted is the first study that I'll go over is the collateral damage of in-school suspensions, a counterfactual analysis of high suspension schools math achievement and college attendance. So this piece represents an advance in what we know because it, one, uses national data, whereas other studies in the past had not. It uses school rates of ISS, which we believe is a form of exclusionary social control to classify schools according to high or low social control levels. We also use in-school suspension because most existing research right now is about OSS, out of school suspension. And because moratoriums on out of school suspension may relate to higher levels of in-school suspension with unknown policy consequences. We relate these two treatments to math test scores and a more distal outcome such as college entry, just to see how long someone is actually impacted by having attended a high social control school. And then we developed a propensity score weights that I just went over previously to adjust for bias that extends from students' non-random, otherwise non-random selection into high and low suspension schools. So we matched these individuals. The propensity scores were actually estimated along these dimensions here that you see on the left side of the screen. SES, which is socioeconomic status, the household structure, meaning the family structure, married, not married, never married, race, ethnicity, gender, parents contacted about behavior in eighth grade because we wanted to match children based on their behavior, about academic performance as well. Then we also used eighth grade math achievement test scores and math grades in order to make sure that we are screening out all that happened previously in the child's educational preparation to isolate what is just happening within high school, and then parental expectations about college. And then within the model, we consider the average social control level of the school, whether ISS, whether a child has been suspended, but we also included average school social order because we want to understand suspensions net of other school characteristics, such as it being one where there's more disorder, or one actually that's more cohesive and socially promotive. Again, socioeconomic status, freshman year math score to screen out again what happened prior to their high school experience, gender, race, absences, and classes skipped to just make sure that we are talking about um, um, or screening out for different levels of presence within school because it's kind of hard to be suspended if you're not there frequently. So we've put all those covariates in the model so that we know what we're talking about when we estimate the effects of social control. So the research questions. What are the short-term and long-term effects associated with attending a high suspension school, and how are these impacts related? How do the effects associated with directly receiving a suspension differ from the indirect effects associated with attending a high social control school or high suspension school in this case? And so how do student background characteristics interact with high school suspension schools when predicting college attendance? And so with the first question, this is what we found. And again, this is the counterfactual design where we are looking at treatment versus control effects. And in this case, we found that high suspension schools were related to lower than average mathematics test performances over the low suspension schools. So again, we're finding that high suspension schools actually um, uh, depress mathematics test performance as we had hypothesized. In addition, high suspension schools decreased the students' odds of attending college, 43% chance versus a 57% chance for high and low suspension schools, respectively. And we also learned that estimates are generally upwardly biased when not controlling for selection in the schools. So it might be that all of the literature out there that does not make these adjustments using propensity score weighting and so forth um, actually have exaggerated or inflated estimates for the impact of suspension, in-school suspension on mathematics. The other question was, how do the effects associated with the suspension differ from the spillover effects associated with attending a high suspension school? And we found some surprising outcomes here, that spillover effects in high suspension schools on college attendance and math scores are similar and at times greater than the direct effects associated with receiving an in-school suspension. So in other words, we're suggesting that not only are those who receive suspensions in schools disproportionately or disadvantaged by the suspension in mathematics and college attendance, but those who aren't direct recipients of the punishment also suffer within those schools. And then question three, how do student background characteristics interact with high school suspension when predicting mathematics scores in college attendance? And we found that significantly lower math scores remained for Black students in high suspension schools after adjusting for their school selection with potential indirect consequences for college entry. So these are our tentative conclusions. First, we retain the hypothesis. The impact of high suspension schools on mathematics is draining the STEM pipeline of diverse talent via spillover effects. And also that ending the school to prison pipeline does not guarantee the STEM pipeline will be filled since significant racial inequality remained after we controlled for in-school suspension and attending a high suspension school. So yes, we retain the hypothesis about the order and obedience seeking impacts of schools on mathematics performance, but we didn't necessarily confirm in this analysis that the STEM pipeline would be filled completely um, or significantly with the elimination of the school to prison pipeline. In other words, some other school level remedies for racial inequality would have to accompany these attempts to decarcerate schools. Um, Also, given moratoriums on out-of-school suspension um, have really been replaced with, have led to the replacement of them with ISS, in-school suspension. Our findings related to ISS suggest that schools need to come up with an alternative to the alternative because ISS is still having disastrous impacts on mathematics achievement and college going, net of all these other school level characteristics. And then also policy and racial reform must work in tandem to address these lingering racial inequities. But we also understood that social control is just not about punishment, in this case, in school suspension. It's also about the technologies that constitute the carceral infrastructure of schools. So, not just punishment, but the systems that are in place to detect whether someone should be punished, receive punishment. Um, so, we came up with some other questions. Does considering levels of social control technology use account for race gender differences in suspension mathematics performance and college enrollment? So similar um, to the previous study, but this time actually looking at the technologies. Do high social control schools increase the likelihood of being suspended? Do they decrease math test scores? And do they decrease the likelihood of attending college? And so the methodology again is pretty similar. That in this case, instead of using in-school suspension and the distribution of the averages of the schools and then segmenting it into quintiles, we instead use the reports of surveillance like metal detectors, cameras, searches such as random dog sniffs, random contraband sweeps, and drug testing, security, uniforms, strict dress code, closed campus for lunch, clear book bags required to actually create an average for school levels of social control. This time, the distribution on that average was segmented into thirds. So the highest third actually included about 3,700 students, and the lowest third included about 4,700 students. Um, and so just so we are clear on how the propensity score weights were estimated, these were all of the characteristics that we included in trying to equalize the student background of the kids that are either in high social control schools or that lower third low social control schools. And I've put a little red circle around the p-values to your right here because they are now they're all insignificantly different between the low social control and the high social control school after they've been weighted with the propensity score. So we've achieved equivalent groups is what this is saying, nearly equivalent. And I'm also sharing these descriptive statistics because I want you to know what's in the model. We have these outcomes here, the dependent variables of college attendance, 12th grade math test scores, and in-school suspension. But we also have the covariates here. Again, considering average levels of social disorder within schools is important. Student behavior, student achievement ideology, meaning to what extent do they believe education or trying hard in school pays off with good jobs, for example. The achievement ideology of their peers, their parent beliefs in their students, teacher beliefs in students, and then we put in the race gender variable here because we're interested in Black males and Black females. And so the results, we find that Black enrollment at high social control schools is 24% compared to only 6% at low social control schools. So in other words, um, Black students are 4 times more likely to be in a high social control school than a low social control school. We also found that Black males and Black females were more likely to be suspended. Um, and then also that attending a high social control school as opposed to attending a low social control school increased the odds of receiving an in-school suspension, net of school level social disorder and individual level misbehavior. We also found that 12th grade math test scores are significantly lower in high social control schools versus the lower social control schools. And this negative 1.51 is just a little lower than a fifth of a standard deviation difference. And then also attending a high social control school as opposed to a low one impacted math test scores after accounting for suspensions. So again, we're finding similarly, just like when we had the high suspension school analysis, that actually the surveillance technologies that are used to determine whether they're high or low in this case has a spillover effect as well, meaning it is actually impacting all students within those schools, whether they've received a suspension directly or not. So again, we find the same thing with college entry, that high social control schools significantly decreases college attendance until student suspensions are considered, and then that effect goes away. When 12th grade math test scores and suspensions are considered, Black females become more likely to attend college. And the previously significantly negative relationship uh, to college attendance for Black males goes away. So accounting for suspensions and math test scores rendered these previously significant effects, um, it rendered them insignificant. So we're now able to say that if we can address social control within schools and address mathematics, that we actually will see or are likely to see um, Black males and Black females doing much better as it relates to their mathematics performance and entry into maybe STEM degree programs when they enter college. So the hypothesis in question is affirmed. The hypothesis was about that order, conformity, and obedience seeking strategies of schools and how it relates to lowered levels of STEM attributes that then make them less likely to perform well in mathematics. But then also that other question about if we drain that school to prison pipeline, might we fill the STEM pipeline? And I think the answer, at least in the second analysis, is yes. Um, some of the other conclusions, though, that we should consider. We should take more seriously the schools feel like prisons complaint, because it's clear that more technology here is having an impact on students. And again, beyond those that are usually targeted by punishment. And so the built environment is key to a healthy school climate. Also, technologies of detection pose consequences to STEM performance beyond the punishment that detection facilitates, right? So yes, those systems are put in place in order to identify those for punishment, but it's clear that there's what we're calling a detection tax or surveillance setback um, that accrues to those who otherwise, maybe behaving in ways that would not lead them to be punished. So again, this spillover effect is impacting more kids than we're actually punishing. And then last, this detection tax leads to fewer Black students among STEM achievers through their overrepresentation in high social control schools. Remember, they were 4 times more likely to be in a high social control school versus a low one. And so the conclusion, where change starts Um, I would say first that we do have to drain the school to prison pipeline in order to fill the STEM pipeline. And it's, not just a metaphor, but in this case, we really do have schools that are unfortunately creating environments where there's lower school attachment, there's a lowered sense of belonging, um, there's a sense of, in some cases, whether there's SROs or metal detectors, sometimes those technologies that we believe should make them feel safe actually make them feel more concerned for their safety. So there is a way in which we need to look at the school to prison pipeline um, more than just individuals going to jail, but more of an educational system and purpose that then has disastrous effects for more than those who are in the pipeline, right? Again, the spillover effects here suggest that students who are not targeted for punishment also are negatively impacted. We, of course, need to demand an end to racism, and broader social reforms are essential to school reform and a diverse STEM workforce. Um, but we also need to prepare for racism to remain. We need to seek systems that are robust to racist intent by embracing transparency and accountability in other ways of thinking about how to promote school health, promote school safety, and promote our students in the process. That would require us to decarcerate our schools. These mass shootings have led us to put more infrastructure and more built environment, um, more technologies within schools that may give us a greater feeling of safety um, than is real for students. And when I say real, I mean oftentimes the same technologies that we feel are making schools safer actually are putting kids at greater risk because we are criminalizing normative child and adolescent behavior. And that's just within the school building. I want to suggest that we should be thinking about this more holistically because there's a whole infrastructure and environment, a whole ecosystem of change that needs to occur in order to decarcerate our schools. For example, I know House Bill 0496 is being considered in Maryland, which would eliminate SROs from our schools and replace them with counselors. And while I think everyone believes that school resource officers and police officers that it would be a better world if they were needed in schools, we also have to understand the conditions that should be in place um, to make that a reality. We also should be considering what other police agencies are doing um, in addressing their part, because whether they're in schools or not, police need to be trained better to serve all individuals, and that would include our youth. And so the Philadelphia Police Department in particular understood that they too could implement restorative principles and decided to actually engage youth instead of, I guess, automatically arresting them with a zero tolerance approach. And they were able to reduce their referrals by 60% the first year and an additional 40% the next year. And I bring that up because oftentimes school reform isn't just about the school and the institution and its leaders undertaking change. It's also about these tangential systems that are inherent, or at least have practiced systemic racism, um, for them to also be reflective and to enact change so that our kids are connected by a web. encircled by a web of supportive services that understand what being a child and being an adolescent is like. So decarcerating our schools would also suggest that we think about trauma-informed practices and that we think about restorative justice and restorative practices um, in order to bring about a better reality for our kids where they're supported instead of criminalized. And so why do this? Some people might ask, and I do understand that some school systems are also dealing with very different realities. Baltimore City Public Schools and some of these larger school systems are dealing with um, what I call the concentration of need among our students. Um, but also, I want to point out that while we are trying to provide the support for those kids, the surveillance setback is like secondhand smoke, meaning that what might be addressing one issue within a school system actually is causing something else quite different. And in this case, it's damaging to the public interest. And I am talking about this as if, um, so that we can kind of imagine what a spillover effect is. It is like secondhand smoke. Workforce diversity is essential to the nation's international competitiveness and security. And again, we mentioned this often at the National Science Foundation in other STEM conversations. But in this case, it is real that we have to get more individuals who are underrepresented and historically marginalized into the STEM workforce because it's in the nation's interest, not just in the interests of those underrepresented populations. And then last, trading the cost of incarceration for the benefits of innovation found in diversity of thought, experience, human capital maximization, greater equity, and less racial social stratification is a win-win. That there should be um, a thinking about these policy proposals not as benefits that target one particular group over another, but that this is true interest convergence when the benefits and what could be secured for those underrepresented and underserved populations actually ends up serving the greater good. So with that, I will wrap up and we can begin with questions. Thank you so much for listening to the presentation. And so this is from Paige. If people argue that the reduction in threats, homicides, et cetera, at schools is directly corollary to the increase in police presence, how do we counter that thinking? And that is a great question, but it's we are seeing even when threats go down that, for instance, um, the laws and the technologies continue to go up. It's not going down because of the um, increase in those things. It's going down despite the increase in those technologies. For example, in 2017, after 2 decades of decline in school level threats, the state of Missouri decided to reclassify causing emotional distress and fighting in K-12 schools from a misdemeanor to a Class A felony. And this went into effect in 2017, January 2017. Um, that type of change is not suggesting that there's a greater problem than in terms of those two outcomes, fighting and emotional distress or bullying, than we had prior to that. That is just um, a political response that actually, I think, advantages political careers more than it does the lives of young people. So there, I just want to argue, and I think I'm so happy you asked that question, but I want to suggest that it's not a response to um, perceptions of increases in things, or at least data-driven perceptions. It oftentimes is in response to other things. And let me give another response here, point out another cause here. Um, Mass shootings. For example, we have a mass shooting, they're rare, but as soon as we have one, we have all of these policy proposals to strengthen some of the either or increase the police presence on school campuses, stiffen sanctions, and so forth. Um, Again, I don't see any reduction in um, um, some of these things that we think are impacted by the presence of police. But what we do know is that those schools with police on campus um, have a 12% advantage or a higher rate of referral of kids to law enforcement than those schools without SROs. So again, oftentimes what we think is making schools safer is actually increasing referral rates that then explain some of the Maryland data that I shared with you earlier about disproportionate minority contact. And then there's, let's see, another audience question from Paige. Not surprising that it affects the non-suspended students at a high suspension school too. What are some hypothesized reasons for the broad impact on all students who attend high suspension schools? And I would say for high suspension or high surveillance schools as well. Um, and so we hypothesize that, and we'll have to think about this and try to pursue other answers with data. But we do know that there's a feeling of linked fate among some populations who see themselves as targeted by carceral systems. Um, and when one person within their network is targeted in that way, then they feel it too. They internalize it as well. And then it impacts other indicators, like perhaps you're less likely um, to enjoy school or feel like you belong there or feel connected to any of the staff there. So that might then increase truancy, dropping out or pushed out, and other potential, negative outcomes. So we're thinking that there's a school climate issue that needs to be explored to understand exactly what kids are feeling when they walk into that high school and go through the metal detector and everything is they have to take everything out of their pockets. What do they feel when there's a hall freeze and then automatic searches for everyone that's caught in the hall freeze? These are just um, ways in which we think these what we call infrastructures of social control function to change the overall climate for kids and their daily experiences, their everyday experiences. Audience question from Christoph. Are there examples of successful programs that replace ISS and encourage positive social engagement? And I would say yes, because I was previously on a school board that tried something new. And so we understood that punishment is actually not the behavior, or let me put it this way, misbehavior is not the actual source of the problem. One source is academic struggle. So instead of ISS, we put in place what was almost like a self-referral um, to another program where students would get one-on-one guidance, or as to what extent, to the extent possible, one-on-one guidance with their academic challenges, because we knew that a person that's disengaged within an instructional setting is more likely to be disruptive. So we're not saying that all students um, um, behave so well that we would not need ISS. But we need to understand the root cause of the misbehavior. And if it's academic struggle, that's something we can deal with, right? Um, and then there are some ways in which we can think about ISS instead of as the um, end result or the punishment, but really a process that really emphasizes restorative practices. So again, this is when we take the individual, the student that we believe is misbehaved, and try to understand the misbehavior, have them try to repair the relationship that may have damaged with a peer or a faculty member, and then move from there about consequences. So these are just some other approaches that people are testing out right now, and some of them are challenging. I think restorative justice and restorative practices um, are 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 weighty changes within the culture of schools, right? Because it's asking you actually to do more relationship building. And that's at the same time that you're trying to manage the behavior of all of these other students. And also in some cases, the teachers feel like you're taking away from them one key lever of classroom management, which is to remove kids and have them suspended or referred. So yes, there are other ways that you can promote positive social engagement that would either cause us to reimagine in-school suspension or get rid of it altogether. From Anna, is there any evidence that a year-round school model would facilitate community building within a school community? That's a great question. And the only research I've done on year-round schooling really looks to the academic impact and not so much um, uh, community building and belongingness and climate. Um, but that's a great question. I would like to know the answer to that question as well, Anna. So we'll have to do some research and figure that out. Sorry, I don't have more information on that. And then from Jennifer, did your study see a correlation between school support resources, population, and high social control? Um, no, we did not. And the reason why we did not is because we did not um, look at those type of school resources. For instance, um, I imagine that we could think about that in terms of school expenditures or looking at rates of receipt of additional support. Um, but we did not get into the support levels for students. And I think that's a great question, something that we would be interested in looking at. The only school differences that were really glaring for us was the fact that schools that were more likely to have African Americans and underrepresented students um, kind of some at times defied our pattern of, filling the STEM pipeline to of draining the school to prison pipeline to fill the STEM pipeline. We actually found that in those schools, many of them, they had robust STEM and school to prison pipelines. It was very interesting in that heavily in schools that had larger concentrations of Black students, they would be more likely to take advanced math courses, but also be more likely than those with lower concentrations of Black students to be suspended. So it was one of those situations where, we had both pipelines being somewhat robust. And so that was one of the key differences when it came to the school level analysis. So Christine is asking, and I think I might have to have this be the final question. What would you say to those who are alarmed by or react negatively to the phrase shut down STEM? That's a wonderful question. Thank you for that, Christine. The one of the observations, and this perhaps is just a value assessment that I have, that we should be disrupting all aspects of social life when it comes to um, disrupting, changing, challenging, resisting police violence. So I think shut down STEM is probably the least that we could do, that there might be many systems that we should be shutting down. But I would also say that STEM is one that is critical. Um, and so if for those who react negatively to shut down STEM, we should be thinking more about how our STEM is used in order to distribute social goods within society, stuff like liberty, justice. And STEM is one of those that we like to make objective when it really isn't. AI is racially biased. Research has its own inherent biases, especially when you end up aggregating up all of these data that were collected through a lens of implicit bias or either a overt racism, and then decide that those data are going to be the basis of the decision making about patrol units, which neighborhoods get more police surveillance than others, which schools receive more resources or less resources than others. So STEM enables, through all of its data science, through all of its computational sciences, it enables the decision making around a lot of the structural racism that is experienced daily. And so I would say to that person that reacts negatively to the phrase shut down STEM, and just try to reach them and say STEM is clearly one of the ways in which society is ordered and organized. And if racism is not there, then racism must not exist. We really must be a society of racism without racists. So I don't know if that would be effective in getting that person to no longer have a negative reaction to shut down STEM. But it nonetheless is the truth, and I think is the basis of having a real conversation. So I see there are so many more questions that I'd love to answer, and definitely would love to continue the conversation in other venues. But right now, I'm going to say thank you to you all for being part of the conversation, and hopefully we can find a way forward in working with many of these challenging issues. So have a great rest of your Fat Tuesday, and I will sign off now and turn it back over. Thank you. Bye-bye.